It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, a titan in the world of consumer protection and corporate accountability, Ralph Nader. Mr. Nader has been at the forefront of consumer advocacy for years. His advocacy has led to numerous legislative and other victories for consumers. One of the first thing that really brought him to public prominence was his 1965 critique of the American automobile industry, Unsafe at Any Speed. And he began working on those issues here at Harvard Law School while serving as the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Record, HLS's student newspaper. In the Record, Mr. Nader published one of the precursors to his breakout book, an article titled American Cars Designed for Death. And we can trace the continued practice of speaking truth to corporate power to the Record today, to the flaw, and as Professor Hansen mentioned, to so many of the other journalists that we're going to hear from this weekend. One other really especially relevant instance of Mr. Nader's advocacy to highlight, in 1993, he initiated the Appleseed Foundation with his classmates from the class of 1958, which created 17 centers for justice and law in 17 states. It's now 18. That was an exciting moment in creating non-corporate opportunities for law students to pursue, and Ralph hopes that it can inspire future lawyers and graduates of Harvard Law School to create those opportunities. So without further ado, we're thrilled to have him here. Please join me in welcoming Ralph Nader.
Thank you very much, Marty, and thank Professor Hansen and you and your fellow students for putting on this day-and-a-half conference. This is a conference that took a lot of work and not a small amount of courage. So it's a conference devoted openly to the subject of corporate capture and over the various areas of legal media, legal education, the law itself, other aspects of our society. I've written about this for Harvard Law students in recent years, and you can find more detail of what I'm going to try to outline in a few minutes on the Harvard Law Record website, hlrecord.org, which has 4 articles. One, Land of the Lawless, which goes to systemic lawlessness or the creation of laws that permit lawlessness, such as exemptions from criminal penalties for corporations. The second is an open letter to Harvard Law students, how they can get more out of their legal education, not just their legal training. There is a difference. The third is a recommendation that there be a curriculum on lawlessness. I titled it Harvard Law School, because that is really very much part of the architecture of the corporate state. And then fourth, it's addressing the question, so you want to go to work for a large corporate law firm. Maybe you need to know more than they're telling you before you enter their structure and sanctions and incentives. And it has 32 architectural achievements for the corporate state and exploitation of powerless people outlined that corporate firms have been the brain trust for. Well, when you talk about large corporations, and I'm talking about giant corporations here, not small business, there's a difference in kind as well as size. Giant corporations have privileges and immunities not accorded to small business, including bailouts, subsidies, giveaways, exonerations, and being too big to fail, too big to jail. So we're talking about the corporate system, which I'm sure your professors still refer to as legal fictions. Corporations are legal fictions. They're not created by investors. This is a popular notion. They're created by state government charters, heavily permissive in states like Delaware and Nevada, and a few federal charters. The charter is the contract, in effect, between the public via the government and the corporation. And it gives them all kinds of powers and immunities and the kind of relationships with board of directors, officers, shareholders, and the outside world. The charter is hardly a subject for law school study. There has been very little scholarly works on reforming corporate charters, updating corporate charters, moving for federal charters instead of Delaware or state charters for giant multinational corporations, rather antiquated systems still in place. Not to mention initiatives to revoke corporate charters. Standard Oil of Ohio had its charter revoked because of its misbehavior. This goes back to early Massachusetts corporate law, which incorporated the modern corporation as we know it, mostly textile firms at the beginning. They did it by legislation, and then it became a charter by a state government corporation commission. But they were very worried about what they were creating. They put these corporations on a time period. They had to be renewed. They had to have a public purpose. They had to restrict their activities to a certain product or line of commerce. They were very wary of what they were creating. And back in the 1930s, Justice Louis Brandeis elaborated that worry in an opinion when he warned the country of creating Frankensteins in our midst. Frankensteins in our midst. So corporations are quite different from you and me. They have a different status, one that allows a great deal of irresponsibility and recklessness, but one that can produce some pretty good things if they are disciplined by outside forces, not just the rule of law, labor unions, organized citizenry, environmental advocates, and public interest lawyers, but they really have to be induced to stay on the straight and narrow. The inherent structure of a corporation is hierarchical and autocratic. And when you have the corporate supremacy that we're going to talk about in this day and tomorrow, that is hierarchical and autocratic, driven by a singular value of sales and profit maximization and expansion of executive pay. Tim Cook, by the way, of Apple, makes $833 a minute on a 40-hour week, $833 a minute from his rubber stamp board of directors. When you have that kind of structure and it has that kind of power, it's legitimate to discuss whether it's compatible with a democratic society at all. Now, Harvard Law School for many years declared a mission in the following words. I never heard it at the time, but here was the mission. Mission of Harvard Law School, that's their declared mission, quote, to educate leaders who contribute to the enhancement of justice and the well-being of society, end quote. And then it proceeded to be the main progenitor of corporate attorneys in the country. There seems to be a little incongruity here, but it's something to hold the law school to its own standards over the years. Our curriculum in the 1950s reflected heavily the job market. And the job market that was desired for and by Harvard Law students after maybe a couple of years at the SEC or Justice Department was to go into the big Boston, New York, Chicago, Washington corporate law firms. And so the curriculum was a form of scholarly control, shall we say. For example, there were no courses on corporate crime, no courses on consumer protection, no courses on environment, almost nothing on civil rights, minimal focus on civil liberties, thanks to Zachariah Chafee. So what goes on here, I said to myself. There's a whole area of American society that's not being treated. Yes, there was one clinic, public defender. You have over 30 clinics now. A lot of the expansion of the curriculum in succeeding years was due to student agitation with the help of some professors at the school. It didn't really come from the school's administration. Now, we had a course called Landlord-Tenant, and I must say, with only modest exaggeration, we never got to the tenant. It was representing landlords. That's where the business is. That's where the lucrative fees are. This kind of bias threaded itself through the whole curriculum. When we studied corporations, we didn't study other ways of organizing economic activity, like mutual structures, cooperative structures, worker-owned structures. They were completely off the table. But of course, we're all pretty clueless to what we were not being taught, what we were not being able to study. And the curriculum now is much better, but it's more diverse, to use the common word. You have various clinics that deal primarily with charitable justice, representing personal clients. There are some, I understand, that work on systemic reform. There is a difference between justice and charity, as you know. Charity provides services like soup kitchens that people desperately need. Justice provides a system of economic livelihood where people don't need charity. So it's good to keep that in mind as you think about yourself as a member of the legal profession. Other thing you need to think about is the difference between a lawyer and an attorney. You're being trained to be attorneys, attorneying for clients, zealously representing them, as the phrase goes. Law schools don't spend much time on the role of lawyers. You have to be both an attorney and a lawyer looking out for the larger systems in the proper administration of justice. And the law doesn't mean anything if it doesn't trend and equate to justice. Fortunately, the Chicago School of Economics, Law and Economics, monetized for a number of years too many law professors' minds and empirically starved them because they measured everything by price in dollars. And they didn't like the word justice. That was squishy. Normative thinking was squishy. It wasn't demanding enough, like the tax code or the securities regulations. Really quite remarkable looking back on it to see how very smart people were fooled. So are we being fooled now by the paucity of attention to the corporate supremacists? Well, it's not very hard to define what corporate supremacy is. And let me try to summarize it. You can do it quite personally and ask yourself, who said no throughout American history to the major forces for a more just society? It was commercial interests, slavery, the cotton plantations, women's right to vote opposed by corporations because women were associated with the consumer movement, among other things. Labor, they opposed labor unions. Farmers, they opposed the regulation of railroads and banks in the late 19th century. They opposed just about everything. The only thing I can recall they didn't oppose is the GI Bill of Rights after World War II because it trained workers for them, educated veterans for them. They opposed militantly Social Security, Medicare, almost all of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal reforms. They opposed progressive taxation, the 40-hour week. They opposed consumer protection, auto safety, the environmental movements in the 1960s and 70s, all opposed. Well, you know, if you have a major institution in society that keeps saying no to humanity and justice, it's permissible to ask why they continue having such credibility. It's because they're corporations. They're not amenable to shame and guilt and ostracism. They can produce huge oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico and business as usual. And when they have to pay, it's insurable, deductible, and sometimes depreciable. And it's all on the corporations, not on the corporate executives themselves. They have shielded themselves. It's almost rare now to see a prosecution of a major corporate executive and a prison term. So ask yourself, when you hear the words crime, regulation, welfare, and violence, what comes to mind? Crime, regulation, welfare, and violence. Well, it could well be street crime, government regulation, government welfare services, and wars and street crime, you know, muggings, rapes, etc. And of course, you would not be mistaken. But if you ask the quantitative question of corporate crime, corporate regulation, corporate welfare, and corporate-bred violence, the figures are much, much larger. You have maybe 15,000 street and domestic homicides in the U.S. You have 60,000 workplace-related deaths in the U.S. according to OSHA. 65,000 deaths preventable from air pollution, EPA figures. You have 5,000 deaths a week in hospitals from preventable problems. That was a study by the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine around 7, 8 years ago, and they thought that was the minimum. That's 250,000 people a year dying from medical error, hospital-induced disease, accidents, whatever, poor prescription of drugs together, and medical incompetence. And it's not even a political issue. No one talks about it, and it's not very well regulated at all. And when you talk about corporate welfare, how about the bailout of Wall Street? Half of what Washington does is shoveling out subsidies, handouts, giveaways, bailouts, preferential treatment to corporations. And it's really not much of a public discussion. It's not studied that much at law school. Corporate violence, I've just mentioned some of the ghastly figures, but there are others as well. And corporate crime, we have a corporate crime wave in this country. When I was at Harvard, crime was totally defined as street crime. And there was never the phrase corporate crime. Once in a while it was white-collar crime, which is a euphemism that's still hanging on to this day. We never studied corporate crime. There were no corporate crime case books. It was not mentioned. Crime was people against people, not corporations against corporations. Another way you can ask yourself how we all grow up corporate, we look at tens of thousands of ads promoting products and services on TV. When we were almost toddlers, we never had any counter ads. I remember growing up, we see tobacco ads and how important it was for you to enjoy tobacco, its taste, and helps you concentrate at work. There were never any anti-tobacco ads. I don't recall ever seeing an ad for mass transit, but we had plenty of ads for gleaming new automobiles. So ask yourself, what do you own? Make a list of everything you own, and you'll see how you're growing up corporate. Because you'll make a personal list of what you own. Will you ever say you're part owner of the commons? The greatest wealth in our country is controlled by people. The public lands, onshore, offshore, the public airways, trillions of dollars in government tax money shoveled out to create or expand existing industries like the computer industry, the genetic technology industry, nanotech industry, aerospace industry. Many of the most serious drugs are handed free to the pharmaceutical industry by the National Institutes of Health, containerization industry that came out of U.S. Navy, R&D, and so forth. We never think that, hey, that's our money. What are we getting for it? Are we getting any royalties? Are we getting adequate royalties? So we don't really study at law schools what we own collectively, which is now controlled by corporations. They really don't care anymore about taking away what we own, as long as they can control the disposition of mutual fund investments, pension fund investments, public lands, control 24/7, radio, TV, increasingly controlling the internet, social media. The third way you can analyze corporate supremacy and corporate capture is to take them at their word in terms of strategic planning. That's what they do. They do strategic planning, and they've got a lot of resources to do it compared to the rest of us. So they strategically plan our public budgets. Over half goes to the military-industrial complex, imagine, and looking for enemies around the world, funding empire. They're strategically planning the disposition of domestic public funds as much as they can. They are strategically planning their control over government agencies, that's for sure. There isn't a government agency or department in Washington where the largest external force on them is not corporate lobbyists. Even the Labor Department is not controlled by unions as much as controlled by corporate capture. Elections, we know how they get involved in all the elections. They've shaped our tax system, our food supply system, our land planning, our environment, workplace, workers, anti-union, minimum wage, starvation wages, and always trying to weaken existing protections and fight more important consumer protections, including access to the courts and banding together of consumers, which is a topic by itself. But they've also captured law enforcement as it relates to them and the criminal and justice system. You have minuscule budgets in the Department of Justice and other agencies to enforce the law. It's as if you had 10 cops in Manhattan to deal with street crime. They can't handle it. Therefore, prosecutorial discretion immunizes huge swaths of corporate crime, fraud, and abuse, and proceeds to settle prematurely with deferred prosecution agreements, no prosecution agreements, with drug companies, aerospace companies, defense companies, and so forth. So they have planned that. Certainly have planned our energy, our fossil fuel industries, constantly obstructing transition to renewables. They have a great influence in our military procurement and policies, and how our foreign policy is executed in various parts of the world. But to show you the expanse of their power, they've even shredded the two primary pillars of private law in our country, the law of torts and the law of contracts. They've taken away our freedom of contracts. Try altering any of the fine print contracts that you click on or you sign on a dotted line and see what happens. There's no meeting of the minds at all. You know, in contracts law, contracts, a meeting of the mind. Have you ever met the mind of Bank of America? And now they're using contracts to cannibalize tort law. So they force you in manufacturing consent on page 80 or page 32 of the fine print contract. Sometimes you can't even see the contract or access it. You just see a summary. They force you to give up your right of trial by jury, waive liability, compulsory arbitration, and so forth. So that's just a scan of their power. You can fill in the blanks in terms of their power over media, and look at the legal media. What's left of it? It's just who's going from one law firm to another. The student publication of the American Bar Association is almost a lifestyle publication. It doesn't deal with the grim realities that you're going to have to face when you go to these corporate firms or you become government lawyers and you have to make very, very tough choices. Now, the corporations' architects are the big corporate law firms. When I was at law school, we were taught to criticize and question everything, including learned hands' opinions, except one phenomenon: corporate law firms. No criticism. And as a result, what we have is arguably the most powerful brokers in American history of facilitating and promoting and immunizing and deceiving the public in terms of how they create, with considerable intellectual rigor, I might add, these corporate supremacists and the maturation of the corporate state. Now, there's no greater achievement by these corporate lawyers than corporate personhood and making these artificial entities equal under the law with real human beings, or corporate equality. Corporate personhood rose its nefarious head in an 1886 opinion involving the Pacific Railroad Company, and it wasn't even the Supreme Court decision by the judges. The scribe who wrote the headnotes in those days was a former railroad attorney, and he liberally interpreted their judgment to include corporations under the 14th Amendment provision of equal protection under the laws. And then the courts were off to the races, one equivalent to another, until about the only thing that corporations don't have by way of constitutional rights is the right against self-incrimination. They haven't yet been able to plead the Fifth Amendment, but most everything else they have. Now, when you have these giant corporations astride the globe, pitting different jurisdictions against one another, tax havens, etc., when you have that and you add their sheer power of command over capital, technology, and labor, and you add their privileges and immunities, what you have is basically a severe system of inequality that subordinates a democratic society to the supremacy of corporatism, the power of corporatism. Thank you, corporate law firms. And the combination of corporate personhood and corporate equality has not become a public issue and not a pressing issue. It's difficult to see what's happening at law schools on all these corporate capture matters, but certainly today is a great contribution to an awareness by the students in that way. Now, what can students be doing? One thing students at law school don't understand is they have a peculiar influence over corporate lawyers if they want to exert it. Number one, the lawyers know that you know more about most subjects of the law than they do because they've forgotten it. They take all these courses, then they become specialized in some aspect of antitrust or some aspect of securities reg, and they never open a book on any of these others. So they know that you're really more up to date on a wider range of law school public subjects. The second thing is you provoke their latent idealism. They know that they were idealistic at one time at law school, certainly many of them, and then they basically spent their next 15,000 days, that's about what they practice, goes very fast, students, very fast, and what did they do? Well, they just served some of the most craven corporate pursuits you can imagine. I've outlined 32 of them in that article I mentioned. It's on the website of the Harvard Law Record. And then they look back and they say, what did we miss? We missed the justice bandwagon. We missed representing the damned, the deprived, the disrespected, the excluded, the discriminated, the impoverished. And they have that in the back of their mind when they face student challenges. In 1970, led by Mark Green and Robert Falmouth, they sent questionnaires to major law firms. They said, we don't want to meet with you unless you tell us what your policies are in terms of conflicts of interest, in terms of pro bono, etc. And the law firms answered those questionnaires. I don't know whether that's still being done now. But in those days, law schools went to Washington, law students rather, went to Washington at our invitation. We had over 400 applications for the summer of 1970 from Harvard Law School students alone. We organized them into task forces. They did exposing studies of the Federal Trade Commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Agriculture, and the Antitrust Division. And these were published. They were all over the national media. The students testified before Congress. There were some really significant changes. Why not today? All with your expectation levels of what kind of significance you want to attribute to your career, whether you want to have a high sense of your own significance. The extracurricular activity at law school was critical for me and for many other students. Sample some of the lectures and topics of other departments at Harvard once in a while, and work on the Harvard Law Record. When I was there, the Harvard Law Record was the second largest legal publication in the country after the American Bar Association. It went out to all the Harvard Law alumni, just automatically. 10,000 or 12,000 lawyers at that time. And it really meant something. And we were so excited to write editorials and monitor things and look at the law writ large. For example, I stumbled on an interesting story that 7 states, at least, in 1956, did not allow women to serve on juries. 0, any juries, including Maryland. And so I wrote that up. And the law students said, gee, we never talk about that in the law schools. Well, you never talk about a lot of things then that you talk about now, fortunately, but still don't talk enough about the corporate capture, the subject here. So in terms of your work after school, Marty mentioned the Appleseed Foundation. Go to the alumni reunions that are in the spring and fall at your law school and talk to the classes that come back and say, if the class of 58 could do something like that, why can't other classes do? One class initiated about 17 centers for law and justice in the United States, and they have a national headquarters in Washington. Imagine what other classes could do, and other classes at other law schools around the country. You know, they knew one another when they were 20, 21, 22, 23, whatever. So, you know, they don't have to BS each other. They can be very candid and collaborate. Well, that's another thing you can do to create opportunities for yourself. Also, remember that NRDC, the great environmental group that has a budget now of about $130 million a year, it was created by Yale law students and 1 Harvard law students right out of law school. They went to some rich people concerned about the environment, and they got underway. We started these student public interest research groups all over the country. They have public interest lawyers. Not as many as are needed, but why not up the ante? If corporations get funded by the taxpayers in Washington, bailed out, crooked corporations, mismanaged corporations, why can't there be a larger fund beyond legal services, which is largely legal charity? Now it's very hard for them to put in systemic lawsuits, thanks to restrictions from the Republicans in Congress. But why aren't there public funds to balance the legal system? Provide more than simply a limited amount of lawyers for indigent accused. So in conclusion, let me just put it this way. You've got a whole career before you where the perils are going to be unprecedented, affecting the world. Just think of global warming, for example. You all know about that. But do you know about the possibilities of destruction from nanotechnology or biotechnology or artificial intelligence? Stephen Hawking signed a letter a few years ago, the British scientist, with leading scientists around the world, saying, if we don't wake up and provide legal and ethical frameworks for these giant technologies, especially artificial intelligence, they will destroy us. And that wasn't just a metaphor. They will destroy, they will go out of control. They're already working on advanced autonomous weapons in some countries, including ours. Never mind the rest. What are you going to do as a lawyer for all these issues? What are you going to do about universal health care, eradication of poverty systemically? Western Europe eradicated U.S.-style dire poverty. Why couldn't we? What are you going to do about over 100,000 people who die because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time, and millions more whose injuries and ailments persist for the same reason? Who are you going to represent? The perpetrators or the victims? Exploited or the exploited? When you go 50 years as a corporate lawyer, I'll assure you, you're going to look back with an empty feeling. You may have 2 or 3 houses and a small yacht, but your empty feeling will be what you can articulate for yourself. Last thing I want to point out before we have a discussion is please volunteer for these extracurricular activities. There should be people reasserting the Harvard Law School Forum. We used to have dozens of speakers from all over the country come to Harvard Law School Forum, real activists, advocates, pioneering public interest lawyers. And I understand that it's sort of moribund now, but it can be reestablished and supported as it was in the past by law school funding. Volunteer for the Harvard Law Record. Bring it to the heights of its potential. Harvard has quite a name of credibility around the country. And Artie Strauss is keeping it alive with a few volunteers, but go to him after the session and say you want to work in various capacities as part of your relief from the focus on your legal studies. So those of you who want to keep in touch with us, finally, I have a column which I've had since 1971. You can go to nader.org and edit. And you can go to citizen.org, that's the website for Public Citizen. And you can listen to my Radio Hour radio podcast. We're going to have soon a small rebellion against the iPhone by high school students in Brooklyn who've created the Luddite Club, and they've gone into a flip phone away from their iPhone. And as one of the founders said, I got my brain back. Well, the last time I was on campus at Harvard Law School, and I walked through the campus passing people by, I couldn't look in their eye. They're all looking at the iPhone. Take another look at what that iPhone and the internet gulag is doing to you, and recover your own self-reliance and control and vision for what you want to contribute to this world of ours, this tormented world of ours. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much again, Ralph Nader.